The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete floor of the animal shelter as Sarah Martinez walked through the narrow corridors. The sounds that greeted her were familiar: barking, whining, the occasional purr from the cat section. But there was one sound that made every volunteer, every staff member, and every visitor stop in their tracks. It came from the isolation wing, a deep, threatening growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. "Don't even think about going back there," called out Marcus, the shelter manager, as he noticed Sarah's curious glance toward the restricted area. His face was etched with concern and exhaustion. "That's where we keep Rex. Nobody goes near that cage without at least 2 backup staff members and a tranquilizer gun ready." Sarah had heard whispers about Rex since she started volunteering at the Pine Valley Animal Shelter 3 months ago. The stories varied depending on who told them, but they all ended the same way, with someone getting hurt, scared, or both. Rex was a German Shepherd mix, around 3 years old, who had been brought to the shelter after being found half dead on the side of a highway. That was 8 months ago, and, in all that time, no one had successfully gotten close enough to properly examine him, let alone show him any kindness. The veterinarian, Dr. Patterson, had managed to treat Rex's initial injuries only by using heavy sedation. Even then, the dog had woken up mid-procedure and nearly taken a chunk out of the vet's arm. Since then, Rex had been labeled as unadoptable and dangerous. The only reason he hadn't been put down was because of a local no-kill policy that the shelter barely managed to maintain. "What exactly happened to him?" Sarah asked, her voice soft with genuine concern. She was new to animal rescue work, having left her corporate job to pursue something more meaningful, but she had always felt a deep connection with animals that others found difficult or unwanted. Marcus sighed and leaned against the front desk, his weathered hands running through his graying hair. "Nobody knows for sure. When the highway patrol found him, he was beaten so badly that Dr. Patterson wasn't sure he'd make it through the night. Broken ribs, fractured leg, cuts all over his body. But the worst damage wasn't physical, it was what somebody had done to his spirit." The shelter had seen many cases of abuse, but Rex's case stood out for its severity. The scars on his body told a story of systematic torture that made even the most experienced animal rescue workers sick to their stomachs. Cigarette burns dotted his fur, his ears bore the marks of being repeatedly grabbed and twisted, and X-rays revealed multiple old fractures that had healed incorrectly because they were never properly treated. "Every time someone approaches his cage, he goes into full attack mode," Marcus continued. "We've tried everything: different people, different approaches, treats, toys, even playing calming music. Nothing works. He just sees humans as threats, and, honestly, given what he's been through, I can't blame him." Sarah nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. Animals who had suffered severe abuse often developed what experts called learned helplessness, combined with extreme defensive aggression. It was a survival mechanism that kept them alive in terrible situations, but it also made rehabilitation incredibly difficult once they were safe. The shelter had brought in animal behaviorists, experienced trainers, and even a few people who claimed to be dog whisperers. Each expert had the same conclusion after observing Rex from a safe distance: he was beyond help. The trauma had damaged him so severely that he would never be able to trust humans again. The kindest thing, they all agreed, would be to end his suffering. But Marcus couldn't bring himself to sign that order. Something in Rex's eyes, even behind all the rage and fear, suggested that the dog he used to be was still in there somewhere. It was this tiny spark of hope that kept Rex alive, even though every practical consideration suggested otherwise. "Can I see him?" Sarah asked quietly. "Just from outside the cage, I mean. I won't try to get close." Marcus hesitated. The shelter had strict policies about Rex. Only senior staff members were allowed in the isolation wing, and even then, they were required to work in pairs and follow extensive safety protocols. But there was something about Sarah that made him reconsider. In her 3 months at the shelter, she had shown an unusual ability to connect with the more difficult animals. Dogs that had been returned multiple times for behavioral issues seemed to calm down around her. Cats that hissed at everyone else would purr when she approached. "All right," he said finally. "But you stay at least 6 feet from the cage, and if I tell you to back away, you do it immediately." Rex might look calm sometimes, but he can go from zero to attack mode in less than a second. They walked through the main kennel area, past dozens of dogs hoping for their forever homes. The atmosphere changed as they approached the isolation wing. The other animals seemed to sense something different about this area. Their usual excited barking died down to nervous whimpers. Even the most confident dogs appeared uneasy as they passed the heavy door marked "Restricted Access, Authorized Personnel Only." The isolation wing was designed for animals with medical issues or behavioral problems that made them unsuitable for the general population. It was quieter here, with specially soundproofed walls and individual climate control for each enclosure. But, despite all the measures taken to create a calm environment, there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Rex's enclosure was at the far end of the wing, separated from the other animals by an additional barrier. As they approached, Sarah could hear heavy breathing and the soft patting of paws on concrete. The cage was larger than the standard kennels, with reinforced steel bars and a double-door system designed to prevent escapes. Inside, she could see a large, dark shape moving restlessly back and forth. "There he is," Marcus whispered, though they were still several feet away. "He knows we're here. He always knows." Sarah's first glimpse of Rex took her breath away, though not for the reasons she expected. Yes, he was intimidating, larger than she had imagined, with powerful shoulders and a coat that had grown thick and wild during his months of isolation. His ears were constantly moving, alert to every sound, and his body was tensed as if ready to spring into action at any moment. But it wasn't his size or his aggressive posture that struck her most. It was his eyes. Even from a distance, she could see the intelligence there, the wariness, and, underneath it all, a deep sadness that seemed to permeate his entire being. This wasn't just an angry, dangerous animal, this was a soul that had been broken by cruelty and was now trapped in a prison of its own fear and rage. Rex noticed her looking at him and stopped his pacing. For a moment, their eyes met across the space between them. Sarah felt a jolt of connection, brief but unmistakable. Rex's head tilted slightly, as if he was trying to figure out something about her that was different from the others. Then, just as quickly, his lips pulled back in a snarl, and he began barking with a ferocity that made the reinforced walls seem suddenly inadequate. "Okay, that's enough," Marcus said, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her back. "When he gets like this, it can take hours for him to calm down." But Sarah didn't move immediately. Even as Rex's barks echoed through the corridor, even as his powerful body threw itself against the cage door with terrifying force, she continued to study him. There was something about the way he moved, the way he positioned himself, that told her this wasn't just blind rage. Every action was calculated, purposeful. Rex wasn't just attacking randomly, he was trying to communicate something, to establish boundaries, to protect himself in the only way he knew how. "He's not just angry," she said softly, her voice barely audible over Rex's continued barking. "He's terrified." Marcus looked at her with surprise. "Terrified? Did you see what he just did? He nearly broke through those bars, and they're designed to hold animals twice his size." "That's exactly my point," Sarah replied. "An animal that's truly aggressive would be more controlled, more calculating. Rex is throwing everything he has at us because he genuinely believes we're going to hurt him. This isn't aggression, it's pure panic." As they walked back toward the main area of the shelter, Sarah's mind was racing. Everything she had learned about animal behavior, everything she had observed in her months of working with difficult animals, told her that Rex wasn't beyond hope. He was trapped in a cycle of fear and defensive behavior that had become his only way of surviving, but that didn't mean it couldn't be broken. The problem was that everyone who had tried to help Rex had approached him as a problem to be solved rather than a traumatized individual who needed understanding and patience. They had tried to impose their will on him, to force him to accept human contact before he was ready. It was understandable time and resources were limited, and the shelter needed to focus on animals that could be successfully rehabilitated and adopted. But Sarah couldn't stop thinking about those eyes, about the brief moment of connection she had felt before Rex's defenses kicked in. Somewhere inside that damaged, frightened animal was the dog he used to be or could still become, given the right approach and enough time. That evening, Sarah stayed late at the shelter, officially to help with the evening feeding routine, but actually to learn everything she could about Rex's case. She read through his medical records, studied the reports from various behaviorists and trainers, and talked to staff members who had been there since his arrival. The picture that emerged was heartbreaking. Rex had been found by a highway patrol officer during a routine traffic stop. The officer, a 20-year veteran named Jim Torres, had initially thought the dark shape by the roadside was a dead animal. It was only when he got closer that he realized Rex was still alive, barely breathing and unable to move. The veterinary report from that first night made for difficult reading. In addition to the obvious injuries, Rex had been severely malnourished and dehydrated. His teeth bore marks from chewing on metal, suggesting he had been chained or caged for extended periods. Most disturbing of all were the psychological symptoms. Rex had been so shut down emotionally that he didn't respond to pain, comfort, or any kind of stimulus. It was as if he had simply given up on existing. Dr. Patterson had worked around the clock to save Rex's life, performing multiple surgeries to repair his broken bones and treat his infected wounds. But, as Rex's body began to heal, his psychological trauma became more apparent. He would flinch at sudden movements, cower when anyone raised their voice, and refuse to eat unless his food was placed far away from any human presence. The transformation from a catatonic, barely alive creature to the aggressive, defensive animal he had become had happened gradually over his first few weeks at the shelter. As his physical strength returned, so did his ability to fight back against what he perceived as threats. The staff members, trying to provide medical care and basic maintenance of his enclosure, had inadvertently reinforced his belief that humans were dangerous. Every time they approached, even with the best intentions, Rex's fear would spike, and his defensive behaviors would intensify. "It's like he's stuck in a permanent state of fight or flight," Dr. Patterson explained to Sarah as she reviewed the case files. "His nervous system has been so traumatized that he can't distinguish between a genuine threat and someone trying to help him. Everything triggers the same response." Sarah nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. Rex wasn't choosing to be aggressive, his brain was literally wired to respond to human presence as a life-threatening situation. Breaking through that programming would require an approach that was completely different from anything that had been tried before. As she prepared to leave the shelter that night, Sarah made a decision that would change both her life and Rex's forever. She was going to find a way to reach him, no matter how long it took or how dangerous it might be. Everyone else had given up on Rex, but she couldn't. Something in those brief seconds of eye contact had told her that he was still in there, still hoping for something better, even if he couldn't express it in any way that others could understand. The challenge ahead of her was enormous. Rex had been failed by every human who had ever been part of his life, and convincing him to trust again would require patience, skill, and a level of commitment that most people weren't prepared to give. But Sarah had always been drawn to the impossible cases, the animals that others had written off as hopeless. She didn't know it yet, but her military background and specialized training would prove to be exactly what Rex needed. Her experience in high-stress situations, her understanding of trauma and survival instincts, and her ability to remain calm under pressure were all skills that would be crucial in the months ahead. As she drove home that night, Sarah began forming a plan. It wouldn't be quick, and it wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to prove that no animal was truly beyond redemption. Rex deserved a chance at a real life, and she was going to make sure he got it. 3 days passed before Sarah mentioned her plan to Marcus. She had spent those days researching everything she could find about canine trauma recovery, reading scientific papers late into the night, and reaching out to contacts from her previous life, a life she rarely talked about at the shelter. What nobody at Pine Valley Animal Shelter knew about Sarah Martinez was that she had spent 8 years as a Navy SEAL, one of only a handful of women to ever complete the grueling training program. She had served 3 tours overseas, working primarily in psychological operations and hostage rescue situations. Her specialty had been reading human behavior under extreme stress and finding ways to communicate with people who had every reason not to trust her. The skills that had made her successful in the military, patience, tactical thinking, the ability to remain calm in dangerous situations, and an understanding of how trauma affected behavior were exactly what Rex needed. But Sarah had left that world behind for a reason. The constant exposure to violence and suffering had taken its toll, and she had come to the shelter seeking something peaceful, something that could help heal the parts of herself that had been damaged by years of seeing the worst of humanity. Now, looking at Rex's case files spread across her kitchen table, she realized that her old skills might be the key to saving him. The strategy she had used to gain the trust of traumatized hostages could be adapted for a dog who had been tortured by the very species she was asking him to trust. "I want to work with Rex," she told Marcus on a quiet Tuesday morning, as they were preparing the morning food distribution. "I think I can help him." Marcus stopped what he was doing and looked at her with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Sarah, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but we've had professional animal behaviorists work with him. People with decades of experience and specialized training. If they couldn't make progress, I don't see how." "I have specialized training too," Sarah interrupted gently. "Just not the kind you might expect." She had never talked about her military service at the shelter. When people asked about her background, she simply said she had worked in security and left it at that. But now, she found herself telling Marcus about her years as a SEAL, about the psychological training she had received, and about her experience working with trauma survivors who had lost the ability to trust. Marcus listened in stunned silence as Sarah described techniques she had learned for establishing rapport with hostile individuals, for reading micro-expressions that revealed true emotional states, and for creating environments where traumatized people felt safe enough to begin the process of healing. "The principles are the same," she explained. "Rex is responding to trauma the same way a human would, with hypervigilance, defensive aggression, and an inability to distinguish between real threats and imagined ones. The techniques I learned for helping people in those situations can be modified for working with him." "But the risk," Marcus began. "There's always risk," Sarah acknowledged. "But Rex isn't going to get better on his own, and every day he stays in that isolation cage, his chances of recovery get smaller. Right now, he's not living, he's just surviving. And, barely." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. The shelter was facing increasing pressure to either find a solution for Rex or make the difficult decision to euthanize him. His care was expensive, his presence made other animals nervous, and the isolation wing was needed for animals who could actually be helped. From a practical standpoint, continuing to keep Rex was becoming harder to justify. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked finally. Sarah had anticipated this question and had spent hours developing a comprehensive plan. "I want to start by simply being present near his enclosure without trying to interact with him directly. Most of the people who have worked with Rex have been focused on achieving specific goals, getting him to accept touch, getting him to eat from their hands, getting him to walk on a leash. But Rex isn't ready for any of those things. He needs to learn that humans can exist in his space without being a threat." The first phase of her plan involved what she called parallel existence. She would spend time in the isolation wing doing quiet activities, reading, paperwork, even just sitting calmly without making any demands on Rex or trying to engage with him directly. The goal was to gradually desensitize him to human presence while demonstrating through her body language and behavior that she posed no threat. "How long are we talking about?" Marcus asked. "Months," Sarah replied honestly. "Maybe longer. Trauma recovery doesn't follow a timeline, and pushing too fast will only reinforce his defensive behaviors. This has to happen at Rex's pace, not ours." Marcus frowned. "The board is already asking questions about the resources we're spending on Rex. I don't know if they'll approve a months-long rehabilitation program for one animal, especially one that might never be adoptable." "What if I volunteer my time?" Sarah suggested. "I can adjust my schedule to spend more time here, and I'll document everything carefully. If we can show progress, even small progress, it might convince the board that Rex is worth saving." After several more hours of discussion, reviewing Sarah's proposed protocols, and consulting with Dr. Patterson about the safety aspects of her plan, Marcus gave his cautious approval. Sarah would be allowed to work with Rex under strict conditions, she would never be alone with him, she would follow detailed safety procedures, and any sign that her approach was making Rex more agitated would result in an immediate end to the program. Sarah's first session with Rex was scheduled for the following Monday. She arrived at the shelter early, before the normal volunteer shift began, carrying a simple folding chair and a book. She had chosen her clothing carefully, neutral colors, nothing that would rustle or make noise when she moved, and comfortable shoes that would allow her to move quickly if necessary. The isolation wing was quiet except for the soft sounds of Rex moving around in his enclosure. As Sarah set up her chair approximately 8 feet from his cage, she could sense his attention focusing on her. She had positioned herself so that she wasn't looking directly at him. Direct eye contact was often perceived as threatening by traumatized animals, but she could observe him through her peripheral vision. Rex was standing at the back of his enclosure, his body tense and alert. His ears were forward, tracking her every movement, and she could see the muscles in his shoulders bunched and ready for action. But he wasn't barking or throwing himself at the cage bars. This was already different from his usual response to human presence. Sarah opened her book and began to read, making a conscious effort to keep her breathing slow and steady. In her military training, she had learned that animals and people could sense stress and tension even when someone was trying to hide it. If she wanted Rex to believe she wasn't a threat, she had to genuinely be relaxed in his presence. For the first 20 minutes, Rex remained frozen in position, watching her with the intensity of a predator sizing up potential prey. But, gradually, Sarah noticed subtle changes in his posture. His breathing became less labored, his stance shifted from fully alert to merely watchful, and, once, she even saw him sit down before quickly standing again as if he had caught himself letting his guard down. When her hour was up, Sarah quietly packed up her things and left without acknowledging Rex directly. As she walked away, she heard him move closer to the front of his cage, and she knew he was watching her go. It was a small thing, but it represented the first sign that her presence wasn't entirely unwelcome. Dr. Patterson, who had been observing from the doorway, was amazed. In 8 months, no one has been able to spend that much time near Rex without triggering a defensive response. What did you do differently? I didn't do anything, Sarah explained. That's the point. I wasn't trying to achieve anything or get Rex to do anything. I was just existing in his space and letting him observe me without making any demands. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah maintained this routine. Every morning, she would arrive early and spend an hour reading near Rex's enclosure. She varied the time slightly, sometimes 45 minutes, sometimes an hour and 15 minutes, to avoid creating a rigid pattern that might increase Rex's anxiety if it were ever broken. Gradually, Rex's behavior began to change in small but significant ways. He stopped positioning himself at the very back of his enclosure when she arrived, choosing instead to settle about halfway back where he could observe her more easily. His breathing remained calm throughout her visits, and she noticed that he was beginning to relax enough to engage in normal behaviors like drinking water and adjusting his bedding while she was present. Most importantly, Rex had stopped viewing her arrival as the beginning of a threatening situation. His body language indicated wariness and caution, but not the intense fear and aggression that characterized his response to other humans. The breakthrough came during Sarah's 3rd week of working with Rex. She had been reading for about 40 minutes when she became aware that something had changed in the quality of the silence around her. Looking up carefully, she saw that Rex had moved to the front of his enclosure and was lying down with his head resting on his paws, simply watching her read. For the first time since his arrival at the shelter, Rex looked peaceful. His eyes were alert but not fearful, his body was relaxed rather than tense, and there was something in his expression that Sarah recognized from her work with human trauma survivors, the tentative beginning of curiosity rather than pure survival instinct. "Hello, Rex," she said softly, still not looking directly at him. "It's nice to see you too." Rex's ears twitched at the sound of his name, but he didn't startle or retreat. Instead, he seemed to settle more comfortably into his position, as if her quiet acknowledgement of his presence was something he had been waiting for. Marcus, who had been checking on Sarah's sessions periodically, was shocked when he saw Rex's relaxed posture during her visits. "I've never seen him like that," he whispered to Dr. Patterson as they observed from the doorway. "He looks almost normal." "Sarah's approach is working," Dr. Patterson replied. "Rex is learning that he can be in the presence of a human without anything bad happening to him. It's the foundation that everything else will have to build on." But Sarah knew they were still a long way from any kind of meaningful breakthrough. Rex's willingness to relax in her presence was a huge step, but he was still contained behind reinforced steel bars, still in an environment where he felt the need to maintain control. The real test would come when she eventually tried to interact with him more directly. As her sessions with Rex continued, Sarah began to notice other changes in his behavior that gave her hope. He was eating more regularly, sleeping for longer periods, and engaging in self-grooming behaviors that indicated a return to normal psychological functioning. The constant state of hypervigilance that had defined his existence for months was beginning to ease, at least during the time she spent with him. Sarah documented every detail of Rex's progress, noting changes in his posture, his breathing patterns, his willingness to move around his enclosure while she was present, and the gradual increase in behaviors that suggested comfort rather than just tolerance. Her reports began to generate interest beyond the shelter. Dr. Patterson shared them with colleagues who specialized in animal behavior, and several requested permission to observe Sarah's sessions with Rex. Word began to spread in the animal rescue community about the volunteer who was making unprecedented progress with an impossible case. But, for Sarah, the recognition was less important than the growing connection she felt with Rex. Every day brought small signs that he was beginning to trust her, beginning to believe that maybe not all humans were dangerous. In his gradual transformation from a terrified, aggressive animal to one who could rest peacefully in her presence, Sarah was also finding something she hadn't expected, a sense of purpose that went beyond anything she had experienced in her military career. The work was slow and, sometimes frustrating, but it was also deeply meaningful in a way that surprised her. Rex's recovery was teaching her as much about healing as her own recovery from the traumas of war. In helping him learn to trust again, she was also learning to trust in the possibility of redemption, both for him and for herself. 6 weeks into their sessions, Sarah decided it was time to take the next step. Rex had become completely comfortable with her presence, often greeting her arrival with what could only be described as anticipation. He would position himself at the front of his enclosure when he heard her footsteps in the corridor, and his tail would give the smallest wag when she settled into her chair with her morning book. But there was still a cage between them, and Sarah knew that real progress would require Rex to accept her presence in his actual space. This was the moment that every previous attempt to rehabilitate Rex had failed. The transition from observing a human at a safe distance to allowing one to enter his territory had always triggered his most violent defensive responses. Sarah had been planning this moment for weeks, developing a strategy based on principles she had learned in hostage negotiation training. The key was to make Rex feel that he was choosing to allow her closer, rather than having proximity forced upon him. This meant she had to find a way to enter his space without triggering his instinct to defend it. Her solution was to change the dynamic completely. Instead of entering Rex's enclosure as an intruder, she would create a situation where he could choose to come to her. This would require the shelter staff to set up a larger, temporary enclosure that connected to Rex's current cage, allowing him to investigate a new space while she was in it, but only if he wanted to. "It's a brilliant idea," Dr. Patterson agreed when Sarah explained her plan. "We've been thinking about Rex as a prisoner who needs to be reached, but you're right, he needs to feel like he has some control over the interaction." Marcus was more hesitant. "What if he charges the new enclosure when you're in it? Those temporary panels aren't as strong as the permanent barriers." "Then, I'll back out slowly and we'll try again later," Sarah replied. "But I don't think he will. Rex has learned to trust me at a distance. He's curious about me now, not afraid. If I give him the choice to approach or stay away, I think his curiosity will win." The setup took most of a Saturday to arrange. The temporary enclosure was about 10 feet by 10 feet, connected to Rex's permanent cage by a gate that he could open himself by pushing against it. Sarah would enter the new space through a separate gate, and Rex could choose whether to investigate this new area where she was sitting. On Monday morning, Sarah arrived to find Rex examining the new addition to his territory with obvious interest. He had pushed the connecting gate open and was cautiously exploring the expanded space, sniffing every corner and marking it with his scent. When he saw Sarah approaching the outer gate of the new enclosure, he quickly retreated to his original cage, but she noticed that he didn't close the connecting gate behind him. "Good morning, Rex," Sarah said as she entered the new space and settled into her usual chair. "I see you've been checking out the new digs." Rex was watching her from the safety of his original enclosure, but his body language was more curious than fearful. His ears were forward, his tail was in a neutral position, and he was leaning slightly toward the opening between the spaces rather than backing away from it. For the first 20 minutes, Sarah simply read her book as she had been doing for weeks. Rex remained in his original cage, but she could sense his attention focused on her, and she occasionally caught him stretching his neck to get a better view of what she was doing. Then, just as Sarah was beginning to think that this session would be like all the others, she heard the soft sound of paws on concrete. Looking up carefully, she saw Rex's head poking through the connecting gate, his eyes fixed on her face. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the 8 feet that separated them. "You can come in if you want," Sarah said softly. "Or you can stay right there. Whatever feels right to you." Rex took one careful step into the new space, then another. His movements were slow and deliberate, and Sarah could see him ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. But there was something in his posture that was different from anything she had seen before, a tentative confidence, as if he was making a conscious choice to investigate rather than simply responding to instinct. When Rex was about halfway into the new enclosure, he stopped and sat down, still watching Sarah intently. It was the closest they had ever been, and she could see details about him that had been hidden before. His coat, while still thick and somewhat unkempt, showed signs of natural grooming. His eyes, while still alert, had lost some of the wild, desperate quality that had defined them when she first met him. Most importantly, his breathing was calm and steady. He wasn't in a state of stress or fear. "You're beautiful," Sarah said quietly, and she meant it. Even with his scars and his wary expression, there was something magnificent about Rex that spoke to the dog he had been before his world fell apart. She could see intelligence in his eyes, a personality that had been buried under months of trauma but was beginning to emerge again. Rex tilted his head at the sound of her voice, and, for just a moment, Sarah caught a glimpse of what he might have been like as a puppy, curious, playful, eager to understand the world around him. The thought made her chest tight with emotion, both for what he had lost and for what he might still become. They stayed like that for the remainder of the session, Rex sitting in the middle of the new space, Sarah reading in her chair, both of them comfortable with the reduced distance between them. When Sarah's timer indicated that her hour was up, she slowly stood and prepared to leave. "I'll see you tomorrow, Rex," she said as she gathered her things. Rex watched her go but made no move to follow or retreat. He seemed content to remain in the new space, exploring its boundaries and getting used to the idea that it was now part of his territory. Dr. Patterson, who had been observing from a concealed position, was amazed by what he had witnessed. "That's the first time Rex has voluntarily approached a human since he arrived here," he told Sarah as she left the isolation wing. "And he looked comfortable doing it. This is a huge breakthrough." But Sarah knew that one successful session didn't mean Rex was ready for normal human interaction. Animals recovering from trauma often made sudden progress followed by setbacks, and she couldn't afford to push him faster than he was ready to go. Over the next week, Sarah continued her sessions in the expanded enclosure. Rex's behavior became increasingly relaxed, and he began to spend entire sessions in the new space with her. He would enter soon after she arrived, settle down where he could observe her, and simply exist peacefully in her presence. It was during her second week in the new setup that Rex made his most significant breakthrough yet. Sarah was reading when she became aware that he had moved closer to her chair. Looking up slowly, she saw that he was now sitting just 3 feet away, well within touching distance if she had chosen to reach out. But Sarah didn't reach out. Instead, she simply acknowledged his presence with a smile and returned to her book. The message she wanted to send was clear: being close to her was safe, and she wouldn't take advantage of his trust by making demands he wasn't ready to meet. Rex seemed to understand this on some level. Over the following days, he began sitting closer and closer to Sarah during their sessions, sometimes so close that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. But he always positioned himself so that he could see both her hands, and he always maintained a clear path back to his original enclosure. The real test came when Sarah accidentally dropped her book during one of their sessions. Rex immediately tensed, his body coiling as if preparing to flee, but he didn't run. Instead, he watched carefully as Sarah slowly reached down to retrieve the book. His muscles relaxed when he realized her movement wasn't directed at him, and he settled back into his previous position. "Good boy," Sarah said softly, and Rex's tail gave a tentative wag at the praise. It was the first time anyone at the shelter had seen Rex wag his tail in response to human attention, and the staff members who witnessed it were moved to tears. This simple gesture represented months of careful work, countless hours of patient observation, and a level of trust that many had thought Rex would never be capable of again. But, perhaps most importantly, it showed that Rex was beginning to remember what it felt like to be a dog rather than just a survivor. The personality that had been buried under layers of trauma was starting to emerge, and, with it came the possibility that he might someday be able to live a normal life. Sarah's documentation of Rex's progress was now being shared with animal behaviorists across the country. Her approach, combining military psychological techniques with traditional animal rehabilitation methods, was being studied as a potential model for working with severely traumatized animals. But, for Sarah, the academic interest in her work was secondary to the personal connection she had developed with Rex. Every day brought new insights into his personality, his preferences, and his growing capacity for trust. She was learning that he was naturally curious, that he had a sense of humor that emerged when he felt safe, and that he was incredibly intelligent, perhaps more so than any dog she had ever known. The breakthrough that changed everything came 6 weeks after Rex had first entered the new enclosure. Sarah was reading when she felt something brush against her leg. Looking down, she saw that Rex had positioned himself so that he was lying against her chair, his body in contact with her leg for the